Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, a slap in the face for free speech. We mark Press Freedom Day by celebrating a campaign aimed at protecting journalists who want to expose wrongdoing and examine how far it has to go. A slap is a strategic lawsuit against public participation, or in plain language, a legal case brought usually by the rich and powerful to intimidate those who want to question their behaviour. Famous examples: Chelsea owner and Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich, who took action against Catherine Belton and her publisher HarperCollins over claims made in Belton's book Putin's People, and attempts by lawyers working for the then Chancellor Nadeem Zahawi to gag tax lawyer and journalist Dan Needle, who had been investigating his finances. We're going to talk about this with Susan Coftree, who is co-chair of the Anti-Slapp Coalition, and Lexi Kirkconnell-Kawana, who is CEO of the press regulator Impress. Welcome to you both. Susan, I want to start with you because you created the Anti-Slapp Coalition. Why did that matter so much to you?
So yes, thank you. I co-founded the UK Anti-Slapp Coalition in January 2021, and that was following on from some research that I was doing at the Foreign Policy Centre, which was examining risks and threats to journalists who uncover specifically financial crime and corruption. And we were particularly interested how that linked back to the UK at a time when the UK was looking at media freedom as a foreign policy issue. We interviewed 63 journalists in 41 countries working specifically to uncover financial crime and corruption, and they pinpointed legal threats as the greatest challenge for them to be able to continue reporting. And moreover, they highlighted that the threats that they were receiving overall, the UK was the leading international source of those threats, almost as high as those coming from the EU and the US combined. So for us, that was a really big red flag as to, well, what's going on here in the UK? Why is the UK such a popular jurisdiction for this type of legal action? And that's why we started the coalition, to work together with many organisations concerned about this issue and see what we could do to look at supporting those who are subject to it. But also from the very beginning, we were looking at different types of solutions that could address this problem.
And many of the cases involve people who are familiar to readers of the Byline Times or listeners to this podcast, people like Carol Cadwallader, Elliot Higgins from Bellingcat, the author Tom Burgess, and so on. And it's fair to say, isn't it, Susan, that you've had a degree of success, that there has already been some anti-slapp legislation brought forward.
Last year, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act provided for the first time anti-slapp provisions in UK law. Now, that only covers cases that relate to economic crime, but that was something, as I mentioned, our research was particularly pinpointing, and I think the cases that you mentioned indicate that as well. However, we are pleased that there's also been some movement in Scotland. They recently announced a consultation on this issue, and this is coming within a kind of wider context of action on slaps more broadly. So just in the last few weeks, we've seen the EU adopt an anti-slap directive. We've also seen the Council of Europe, which the UK is still part of, a recommendation on slaps. So this is not happening in isolation, nor is the issue just about economic crime. There's a wide range of topics and a wide range of individuals as well. I mean, my focus has been investigating cases related to journalists, but we see academics affected, we see individual activists, and more just ordinary people who want to speak out about a matter of concern, and they're facing legal action trying to shut down that public scrutiny.
And it's just worth reflecting a moment, I think, on the effect that this has on individual journalists who are threatened with loss of earnings, potential loss of their property. The impact of losing a defamation case can be absolutely horrendous. Now, of course, journalists have an obligation, a duty to try and report fairly and honestly and accurately, but the nature of some of these actions that we've been talking about is that they would be absolutely ruined if they lost these cases.
Yes, and it's the reason why many people don't take them. I mean, further to the research I mentioned at the beginning, we then produced a report called London Calling, which tried to examine why is the UK such a challenging jurisdiction. And it is the amount of money it costs. I mean, it's not just defamation cases that are used. Privacy, GDPR, and other claims are forwarded for this purpose. But if we look at defamation, it's £500,000 to defend a defamation case to trial here in the UK. And that's the floor. They can go up to 1 million or more, particularly if there's multiple claims. I mean, for example, Catherine Belton, whose cases were settled relatively early stage, cost her publisher 1.5 million to get to that point. But even early hearings to decide on jurisdiction or meaning, 50,000 to 100,000 pounds. And frankly, most people don't have that. The other challenge, of course, is that it takes a very long time. Most of the cases that we see that do get to trial stage take 2 to 3 years. So you're tying up people in incredibly expensive, stressful, and lengthy processes, which is partly the aim of a SLAP, is not actually to really get to the truth. It's to exhaust someone into compliance. And then if they do that, you might even not know that there was a legal action or a legal challenge in the first place. So what you're left with is basically vacuums of information about matters that are really important for public interest, and we don't know about them.
Yeah, and so the temptation, given the very high costs involved in legal cases like this in the UK, is that you as the individual journalist or your publisher will simply fold, will agree not to publish the allegations, may even issue an apology, not because it's not true, but simply because you cannot afford to defend the case against an extremely wealthy individual.
Absolutely. And also you have to think that these aren't just one-off cases that are happening occasionally, particularly if you're working in sensitive investigative reporting. This is routine that you might be getting legal action, legal threats, and therefore there's only so many resources to go around. And there is a decision, is this a case that we can really back, even if we believe it's true, just because it is a huge effort to defend the case.
And Lexi, I suppose the question for you then is that if we had a proper system of press regulation in this country, could we dispense with SLAPs altogether? Why are oligarchs, why are very wealthy people going to court rather than seeking redress through an organisation like Impress?
I mean, you've sort of hit the nail on the head there. The fact is that very wealthy and powerful interests can see the vulnerabilities of the system that we have here in the UK, and they know the exorbitant legal costs that face journalists and news publishers in going to court. Whereas if they had to go through due process through a regulatory body, that would be levelled because costs don't determine the outcome in those situations. And, I want to draw on a point you made earlier, Adrian, the fact that, for many publishers that are out there, they're not large businesses, they're small micro businesses that are trying to do the right thing, publish legally and ethically. But the fact is that the costs of facing down these legal claims mean that for many of them, even facing a legal writ means shutting down the whole operation. And no, that's not the cost of doing business for being a publisher here in the UK. It's deeply unsatisfying that free speech is being shut down because people can't afford the legal expenses of defending their speech. And to go to your original question, what would effective regulation do? The fact is that 10 years ago, there was a very considered, comprehensive judge-led inquiry on what the solutions to this could be. And one of the creative solutions to that came out of it was regulation. That if news publishers didn't want to face exorbitant legal costs, they could create a body that offered low-cost arbitration to the public. And if they tried arbitration and still ended up in court, a judge wouldn't require them to pay costs. Now, Impress, our organisation, is the living, breathing embodiment of that, but it is certainly not supported by government. We've been asking government for 8 years now to introduce measures to support that. But on the other side of it, I'm really proud to say that none of the publishers that have joined us have been successfully sued because the system works.
But the idea then is that Impress or another regulator would become a legally enforceable first stop for anybody who's got concerns, who believe that they had been defamed. Is that your thought?
Absolutely. The way regulation works in all sectors, not just media, is a first instance triage. It doesn't mean that you then can't go on and escalate it to court. It just means you first exhaust a good due process that's robust and independent and impartial to get there. And so only the most complex cases, only the ones that have those really fine balanced judgments are the ones that end up in court. But at the moment, that's not the situation we have. We have very spurious and vexatious claims being made. And those ones, as Susan's pointed out, are already chilling and shutting down free speech. So we've got no way of testing those. And unfortunately, the legislation that's being introduced is a real sticking plaster because it starts at the point where the claim enters a courtroom. And as we know, a lot of good journalism, a lot of good, free and fair speech is being shut down before it even enters a courtroom. So the solutions that are being offered are nowhere near the actual root and cause of the problem.
Let's talk about the limitations of the private members bill, Susan, that is being brought before Parliament at the moment. It's a remarkable achievement for any campaign group to have legislation brought forward, but you're concerned that it doesn't really do the job.
No one thing is going to be a silver bullet for this problem. Right from the very beginning, the coalition advanced solutions along three lines. One was legislation. The other is regulation of lawyers, solicitors, which there's also been some progress, which we can perhaps touch on, but also cultural change. And that sounds very nebulous. But I think the fact that we all are here talking about slaps, and I think there's a great deal more awareness of what slaps are than there was 3 years ago. And particularly to Lexi's point, that they don't start in the courtroom is in itself an achievement. Turning to the legislation, the UK introduced these anti-Slapp provisions in the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act last year, which was a good first step. It put slaps on the statute books. It recognised it here, at least as far as England and Wales, and the UK became the first national government to introduce anti-slap laws. However, we have a longer history. The US has already legislated on a state level. I think there's 34 US states have anti-slap laws, and they've been emerging over the last 20 years or so. And as I mentioned, there's also been movement in Europe. In terms of what we would like to see as a coalition is a law that allows for the early dismissal of cases and based, really on a threshold of whether or not the subject matter is in the public interest. And at the moment, the government's proposal, which is now replicated in effect in the private members bill, which has been brought forward by Wayne David, but there's been a lot of obviously cross-party collaboration on this. So the government has indicated they're supporting it. And the current text contains basically the same sort of provisions as we saw last year, but expanded beyond economic crime. At the moment, in the form it's currently drafted, it places a lot of importance on the thinking of the claimant who's bringing the case, so the filer of the case, what they were thinking. And nobody who's bringing a slap is going to say, "Hi, I'm bringing a slap," as a starter for 10. So there are concerns that in its current formulation, that kind of threshold will require a defendant to basically try to evidence what their opponent is thinking, and they'll tie up in knots at a very early stage into proceedings which completely get away from that early dismissal mechanism principle. So I think Wayne David, the MP who's bringing forward the bill, has already recognised that. My understanding is that there will be some amendments when it comes to committee stage, but at the moment, yes, it's falling short of what it needs to do.
So just so I understand that properly then, the judge would have to decide whether the person who was bringing the lawsuit was intending to simply gag reporting, which was in the public interest. And it's that question of intentionality that the judge has to decide on. And of course, as you say, the person bringing the lawsuit is never going to admit that they are intending to gag public interest journalism. They'll say, "No, I have been defamed." I mean, there is an important point here as well, as Anna. I come back to this, that people who have been wronged by the press, and this is another side of the work that you do, Lexi. We know that there are news organisations who are very fast and loose with the facts on occasions, and who seek to rubbish the reputations of those who they might regard as political opponents.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, by adding these layers of tests for judges to consider in advance may well put additional burden on those legitimate claims. right? And again, all of this is starting to add to the cost burden for both sides to have to participate in new standardizations of these types of legal tests as they develop. And the consequence of it is more cost on either side, rather than addressing these core upstream issues about the fact that on both sides you can have legitimate and vexatious intention. And if we had better triaging at the earliest stages of these matters, then you wouldn't be able to game the system by leveraging the costs in your favor one way or the other. If you're, a powerful news group on one side, intruding on the private lives of an individual, or if you're a powerful subject of reporting or a story who's trying to gag a independent and ethical journalist or speaker. And it's therein that I'm really concerned about the sort of out of touch nature of a lot of the decision makers here, and not appreciating what's happening on the ground, how the system's being weaponized, how cost burden is being weaponized, and again, not coming up with solutions to actually address that at the heart of it.
I would just say, for those who aren't so familiar with the sort of anti-Slapp model, it brings in a early dismissal mechanism which cuts across any legislation that's being used to pursue a slap, which, as we mentioned, is defamation, but privacy and others. We're not going in and tinkering with those laws in and of themselves, and I think there would be much of an argument to do so from many quarters, particularly on the cost, because, as Lexi says, if there's somebody who has been targeted or wants to bring a claim, it's very expensive for the ordinary individual to do that as well. But I think what's very effective, particularly about the slaps, is that it's not just media. We've noticed recently with the coalition quite a few individuals who are leaving reviews on review websites for services they've received, and they're getting legal action. And so, this is a much wider picture than just media. And this is why it's so important now that we've got this universal law going forward, a standalone law. And because it needs to be something that's accessible to everybody and not just for media and not just on issues like economic crime, although, of course, that's my starting point.
On the legislation that's been brought forward, Susan, it is, as you say, a private member's bill. Very often private members' bills are designed just to raise attention to a particular issue. But do you believe that this will become law in some form or another?
Well, I think there is a good chance. The government had already committed in July 2022 to legislate on slaps. It always said with the economic crime provisions last year that was a first step. We were always told that parliamentary time was an issue. But at least here with the private members bill, it's been brought forward by a Labour MP, as I mentioned, but the government has indicated its support. And I think that is in line with what it's said thus far about its intention to legislate in this area. It's just, for us, critical about how that legislation is formed and the final version, so that it can actually be effective and do what it says on the tin, basically, not just be something that's in name only. It has to be effectively implemented. And that's really what this kind of critical stage is about now. I think the other thing I'd really love to touch upon is just, funny enough, regulation of lawyers, because the legal process starts with legal letters that go from the claimant lawyer to the defendant and may never have got any further than that. And if you are a journalist with an in-house legal lawyer that you can rely on to get advice right away, that's one thing. It doesn't take away from the challenges of defending it. But if you're a freelance journalist who's got a legal letter and you don't know what to do or to get legal advice, and they're coming private and confidential, and you're intimidated at that stage, you might not do any more to defend it. And these letters can be written in a very intimidatory and scary fashion, and are intended to do that because ultimately they want the article taken down or they want the inquiry into something to stop. And I think what has been useful, particularly about the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, who issued a warning notice on slaps in 2020, is it set out, in line with its code of conduct, behaviour that's expected from lawyers. And it's not conflating lawyers with their clients, but the tactics they choose to pursue on behalf of their clients, which I think is very important, and being more mindful of the tactics they use, particularly when writing to a big media organisation or an individual, for example. And we have heard that there has been some positive shift in tone about that. And I think it is probably because people understand now that what they write may be seen. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that lawyers can do a little bit better here, but also obviously in advocating for their clients' interests, many lawyers will look at what's the easiest pathway for that. And again, the vulnerabilities of the system here are largely around the cost burden. Again, we have to look at alternative solutions to do that. Now, we know at Impress that regulation is one of them, but also using alternative dispute pathways is another. Obviously, those trying to game the justice system will always do so, but people that are acting in good faith and do want to hold both power to account in their speech, but also hold powerful speakers to account, can look at alternative ways of resolving their disputes outside of the court system and outside of legal proceedings as well. And those options are emerging more. We're starting to see judges direct people back to alternative dispute resolution so that they're not using the court process as a way to silence speech and or stifle the rights of individuals. So there are emerging solutions. There is greater attention to this issue. Really pleased about that. But we need to continue to support those and incentivize that.
Lexi, your organisation, Impress, is one of two press regulators. The other is IPSO. Yours was created by Royal Charter following the Leveson report, which you referenced earlier. You know that the charge that will be raised against an organisation like yours, and indeed has been, is that you are a state-sponsored press regulator, and that will send a chill down the spine of anybody who cares about press freedom. So in this context, how do you respond to those criticisms when people might look at you and say that you are effectively the stooge of any government that might be in power?
Again, it's a very natural question, but one that obfuscates a little bit of the facts of the situation, which is that the Royal Charter creates lots of different types of bodies, such as charities and universities. The BBC is a creature of charter. Being a charter body doesn't make you state-sponsored or state-backed. It just means that you have a level of supervision to ensure that you're independent and you're effective. Impress was created by publishers and journalists and civil rights activists and advocates. It wasn't created by the political class. It's not sponsored by the government. It's completely independent. And that's a really interesting model for looking at a solution here, one which prioritizes press freedom, that's co-created with publishers and the public and civil society as a way of taking all of these issues out of political and legal systems and putting it back, that power back into the public's hand to determine what should be the standards and norms around the speech that we have and how should we promote free speech, but also balance it with the rights of individuals. So it's a really interesting model. It's completely politically independent, but it does have the type of supervision and robustness you'd want any regulatory body to have. So I think it's a model to be really proud of and one we should be championing rather than sort of throwing political muck at.
Well, I mean, the truth is that many of the people who denigrate you have a vested interest in running you down and were supporters of the now thoroughly discredited Press Complaints Commission, which was the predecessor body, which clearly allowed many shocking things to occur under its watch in the world of journalism that prompted the Leveson inquiry in the first place. And we've featured on the podcast before calls for Leveson 2, which was designed to examine the relationship between the press, the police, and politicians. Theresa May, because she wanted the backing of one of those newspapers, the Daily Mail, decided to scrap Leveson 2. So the idea that we have some kind of state-controlled press in this country is clearly a nonsense. But would you welcome a Leveson 2, Lexi?
There are parts of Leveson 2 which really focused on, news of the world and are pretty defunct now, but there are some really interesting parts of it that we haven't been able to interrogate and get to the bottom of, which were the nature of those relationships and how they can inform what we can do better today. If we think about what are the key threats to press freedom now, legal threats against journalists and publishers being one of them, the interplay and the closeness and the undue influence between politicians and the press. If we want to create a positive media vision for the future, where we do have a free and fair press. Further inquiry on what we can do better is no bad thing, but we also need to start doing and acting, which is why Impress is the embodiment of the values that came out of Leveson, which, as I've said, was a very considered and comprehensive inquiry. I think is really positive.
Lexi Connell-Kawana from Impress, the press regulator, and Susie Coftree from the Anti-Slapp Coalition. I'm Adrian Goldberg, and you've been listening to the Byline podcast. If you want to support our work, then please take out a subscription to the Byline Times. It is a brilliant monthly newspaper which contains the best of our online offerings with content that you can't read anywhere else. Do head over to bylinetimes.com and take out a subscription if you can. That's at bylinetimes.com. This has been a We Bring audio production made in Birmingham. We'll see you again very soon, but for now, goodbye.